Kelvir walked through the grand halls of the Aurelian Concord archives, where the air smelled of static ink and cold light and the silence itself felt alive. He moved slowly between tall shelves of memory crystals, pretending to be calm while his heart raced with a hidden fire, for he had seen something no one was allowed to see. A piece of truth buried under centuries of lies. The Concord called humans a myth. Just another story told to children to remind them that imagination was dangerous. Yet Cale had found fragments that said otherwise, and he could not unsee what he had read. The metal scrap he held in his pocket carried a single word, carved by a steady human hand, and that word was home. He traced its letters with his thumb, feeling the indent as if the ghost of the maker still whispered through the metal. Outside, the capital skies glowed with artificial auroras celebrating Founders' Day, while Cale walked unnoticed through the crowd, his mind spinning around the impossible what. If the old stories were true, what if humans were not gone but hidden? What if the Concord itself had made sure their memory was erased? He knew such thoughts could end a career, or worse, a life. Yet curiosity pulled him like gravity toward the forbidden wing of the archives, guarded by drones and scanners that could read intention better than faces. He waited until shift change took a cleaning cart from a friend and rolled it down the long corridor, pretending to hum like a worker who wanted only rest. Deep inside, he reached a locked chamber where files had been wiped and data fields left blank, entire centuries of history missing, like a page torn from a sacred book. He shivered as he saw faint traces of burned symbols on the wall, as if someone had tried to erase the past with fire. He used his small reader to copy what fragments remained, and when the drone lights passed, he froze, holding his breath until they dimmed. Then he slipped out with the stolen truth hidden close to his chest. Far across the stars in the dark quiet beyond the Thorn Gate, the human fleet drifted in silence, their hulls cold and their beacons dimmed to ghost light. Captain Rhea Salas stood at the bridge of the Union ship, dauntless, watching the endless night. Through the forward glass, her reflection looked older than she felt, but her eyes held the steady calm of someone who had already faced fear and chosen duty again. And again, she and her crew had come not to fight, but to find their lost kin. Those, scattered after the last great exodus long ago, the conquered territory lay ahead, vast, powerful, and blind to their existence. The old maps called it restricted space, but for Rhea, it was where home might begin again. Her officers moved quietly around, her reading silent signals across screens. They had intercepted faint calls from stranded miners near the Concord border. Pirates had found them and were closing in. Rhea stood unmoving, listening to her comm officers speak the coordinates she knew. They had only one choice: help them, even if it meant being seen. She whispered to the helmsman to light no beacons and keep their reactors masked, yet burn for the distress signal. The ship shifted its angle, gliding through a nebula shadow like a predator wrapped in smoke. On the Concord side, command sensors picked up strange formations moving beyond the outer markers. Analysts argued over the data. Some said it was a glitch. Others claimed a forgotten species had returned in secret reports, whispered of vessels moving in perfect formation like disciplined soldiers, and their heat signatures matched no known design. One young officer laughed, saying, maybe it was the mythical humans coming back to finish their stories, and the room fell, silent as the old joke no longer felt funny. Cale, meanwhile, met his old mentor Saren, who had once taught him that knowledge is both light and fire. She listened to his discovery without surprise and told him softly that truth has been waiting for a voice brave enough to carry it. She gave him a small data key and told him to leave the capital at once. A diplomatic cruiser was heading to the Thorn Gate, and it needed an observer. Cale did not ask why she trusted him with this. He only nodded, packed his few things, and walked toward destiny. When Dauntless reached the broken beacon, the miners were desperate, and their signals weak. Rhea's voice came across the radio, calm and sure like a promise. From the past, she told them to hold formation and wait for her cover. Her ship cut between the pirates and the convoy shields, humming softly. She could see the raiders on scan, hesitating to attack this unknown vessel with strange armor markings. She spoke through open channels, offering mercy and passage if they turned away. Her tone carried no threat, only strength and something older. Something human. Cale sat aboard the cruiser, watching the conquered stars through the glass, unaware that just beyond the same sky the myth of humanity was taking shape in real metal and fire. The universe had held its breath for too long, and now the silence was breaking. Both Kale and Rhea were about to become the first names written in a new chapter, one that would shatter the borders between legend and truth signals. In the dark, the Concord border was quiet at first, but quiet in space never lasted long. The silence always carried the sound of waiting, as if the stars themselves held secrets that could no longer sleep inside the command tower. Above the Thorn Gate, a line of officers stared at strange readings moving across their displays. The signals were faint, then strong, then gone again, as if shadows of ships passed between worlds. A commander barked orders to recheck calibrations, but deep down, every veteran on that deck knew what they were seeing. Formations, deliberate, steady, moving like an army that remembered discipline. The young officers tried to laugh it off, calling it phantom echoes or sensor ghosts from mining debris. Yet no one really believed it, and in the silence that followed, even the hum of the machinery felt like a heartbeat. Kyle Veer sat aboard the diplomatic cruiser Luminant, watching the border grow brighter through the viewport. The ship's crew treated him politely but distant. They thought he was just another scholar gathering notes for reports that would never matter. He held his small reader close, replaying the fragments he had stolen from the archives. The data showed star coordinates that aligned perfectly with this sector, and he could feel it in his bones. The erased history led right here. He tried to sleep, but dreams came of broken ships and voices calling across time, whispering you were never alone. He woke with a start, his heart pounding, and saw the captain of the cruiser standing beside him. The woman introduced herself as Talia Wren and said softly that the council had ordered strict observation, no interaction, no signal transmission, no interference. He nodded, but in his mind he was already breaking that rule. Curiosity had never obeyed command. Far on the other side, Captain Rhea Solis stood at the bridge of Dauntless, her ship gliding in cold stealth under the veil of a nebula. She looked calm, but her thoughts moved like wildfire. She had just received partial scans of Concord defense grids and knew that soon they would notice the movement of her fleet. She had 12 ships under her command, all silent and running cold. Their hulls darkened, their power signatures reduced to almost nothing, yet even hidden. They moved like a heartbeat across the dark. The miners they had rescued were safe now, tucked behind the fleet's tail, and the first whispers of humanity had already started leaking across pirate channels. Rhea felt the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes. She knew the universe had just turned its gaze back to mankind. In the capital of the Concord, the High Council gathered in a chamber lined with starlight mirrors. 10 figures seated around a table of crystal light projecting the signals captured by the Thorngate station. The oldest member, Counselor Dareth, leaned forward and asked quietly whether these ships matched any known registry. The analyst replied, "None known. None logged, none sanctioned. The ships fly without Concord IDs, and their formation suggests an origin outside the known systems." The room grew tense and cold as someone whispered the forbidden word, humans. The silence that followed felt endless until Dareth said, "Such myths died with our ancestors," and yet no one dared agree too loudly. Kale stared at the growing brilliance outside the viewport as the Luminant approached the outer rings of the Thorngate. He felt the hum of the engines change, and he knew they were near something immense, something alive. He looked to the captain, who watched the same screen with narrowed eyes. Both saw faint shapes moving between stars, symmetrical, beautiful, and terrifying. Kyle whispered to himself that myths do not travel in formation. Back on Dauntless, Rhea received a coded signal from her scouts. They had detected Concord ships adjusting position, a patrol moving closer toward their lane. She turned to her second-in-command, Commander Elias, who asked if they should change course. Rhea shook her head slowly, saying, "We came to be seen sooner or later. Better it be now, but on our terms." The crew exchanged silent glances. They all knew what that meant. Shields warm, weapons, cold engines ready. They would face whatever came without firing. First, Kale went to the observation deck alone. The stars stretched out before him, endless silver veins through black glass. He thought about the generations that had lived believing that humans were only stories told by liars and dreamers. He thought about what it meant for a people to be erased and yet still find their way back. The idea filled him with awe and fear. At once he wanted to tell someone, but he could not. He could only wait and listen. to the signals in the dark. The Thorn Gate began to glow brighter as if waking from sleep. The patrol ships turned their lights outward, scanning for intruders, and in that same breath, Rhea ordered her ships to slow to half speed. They came out of the nebula veil like ghosts, returning home, the hulls bearing the old insignia of the Union, the long-lost symbol of Earth. The first Concord watch officer to see them dropped his stylus and whispered, "They are real," Kale's communicator. Blinked with emergency channels, and he felt his throat tighten. He could see the unknown fleet forming before the gate like a constellation reborn. He knew in that instant that every story, every warning, every erased page had led to this moment, and that neither he nor the Concorde would ever see the universe the same way again. The fleet of humanity had crossed the border of legend and stepped into history once more, and in the silence between stars, even the oldest myths began to breathe again. A line in starlight, the Thorn Gate shimmered. Like a crown of broken suns, each of its massive rings glowing in pale gold light, as Concorde patrol ships formed their barrier lines around it. The news of the approaching fleet had already reached the command tiers, and for the first time in a century the Concorde Council declared a silent alert, the kind that was never broadcast to citizens but made every officer on duty breathe slower and check their pulse. Cale Veer stood by the viewport of the diplomatic cruiser Luminant, staring at the distant motion of shapes that defied the night. His reflection trembled in the glass as the stars moved behind him. He knew what he was seeing were not sensor ghosts, nor distortions. These ships flew with precision, with rhythm and grace. Every formation spoke of design and will, the same kind of will that built worlds and crossed them. They were not rumors or fabrications. These were humans. The captain of the cruiser, Talia Wren, ordered her crew to hold position at the outer rim she opened. Secure channels to the High Council, waiting for instructions. The command room filled with static as distant voices overlapped, all trying to speak at once, orders coming and changing with every passing minute. Cale listened quietly, feeling the tension rise in the air as if the ship itself could sense history bending around it. Talia turned to him and said, "They are telling us to observe but not to engage. If these are truly humans, the Council will want proof, not contact." Cale nodded, but he could see the worry behind her steady expression. He whispered softly that sometimes proof is not given, it is shown. Meanwhile, on the other side of the border, the human flagship, Dauntless, led the formation forward, its engines burning softly in the vacuum. Captain Rhea Salas stood tall in the center of her bridge, surrounded by an aura of calm purpose. The crew around her worked in silence, the air filled with the hum of power conduits and the faint rhythm of tactical pings on the nav screen ahead. The Thorn Gate shimmered like an ancient temple standing at the edge of legend. Rhea knew what this moment meant. It was not just a border crossing. It was the reawakening of truth. She closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the stories she heard as a cadet, how their ancestors had once walked among the stars before the Great Silence, how every child of Earth carried a seed of that memory inside them. She whispered to herself that it was time to stop being shadows. The Concord patrol captain, aboard the station, Dervin Prime, received orders to intercept and identify the fleet. He had never seen ships like these. Their shapes were old, yet new. Their signals pure and unencoded, the kind of confidence that only came from those who knew who they were. Dervin hesitated before giving the command to hail. He had grown up hearing that humans were dangerous creatures of instinct and chaos. Yet when the image flickered onto his screen, what he saw was not chaos, but discipline. The face of a human officer, calm, serious eyes full of purpose. The officer introduced herself as Captain Rhea Salas of the Union of Human Systems and requested safe passage to rescue stranded civilians caught near conquered territory. Dervin's words caught in his throat for a moment. He said, "The Conquered has no record of your Union existence, and this sector is under restricted law." Rhea's reply was simple. "Then perhaps your records need correcting." Cale watched from the deck as the transmission played. Across the council channels, his hands trembled as he realized that the myth was no longer a myth. It was flesh and voice. The council chambers filled with noise as some demanded defense activation while others argued for diplomacy. The chancellor, raised his hand and the chamber fell silent. He said that no one fires until the fleet shows hostility. We will speak first, then judge later. Yet the older factions whispered of danger and power, slipping from their grasp. The myth of humanity had kept the conquered united now that myth was breathing again and truth was a threat greater than war. On dauntless Rhea felt the weight of centuries pressing on her shoulders, but she did not flinch. She ordered her fleet to maintain formation. No weapons, no shields, just navigation lights shining like soft stars across the black. She sent another message repeating her purpose. We seek the lost, and we mean no harm. Her voice carried across the relay nets into 1,000 Concord receivers, and for a long moment, the galaxy simply listened. Cale stood in the observation dome of the cruiser, the light of the Thorn Gate washing over his face like dawn. He thought of his teacher Saren, and her warning that truth always comes with a price. He wondered, if she had known it would come this soon. He felt both joy and fear twisting together like twin stars pulling each other apart. He whispered under his breath that the universe was watching now and it would never look away again. The patrol ships around the gate shifted formation, giving cautious space to the human fleet. The first line of light drawn across the void, marking a fragile truce. A corridor of starlight between history and myth. Rhea's fleet slowed their engines and glided forward. In silence, she turned to her bridge crew and said softly, "This is how it begins, not with fire but with recognition." Every eye on the ship watched the gate's rings spin around them as if the universe itself was opening its door for them. Cale could not breathe for a moment. He could feel that the meaning of everything he had ever studied had changed before his eyes. The words of his ancestors, the erased pages, the forbidden archives, all of it pointed to this instant, when humanity would cross, the line not to conquer but to be seen again, and somewhere deep within him, he understood that this crossing was not just for humans, but for every species that had ever been told their story was impossible. As the fleets hung between the light of the gate and the shadow of fear, a pulse of energy rippled through the void, marking the boundary of a new era. The myths had become real, and the stars would never sleep again. Proof of flesh and fire. The Thorn Gate burned brighter than it ever had before, as if every sun that fed its rings was waking from a long-forgotten dream. And all across the conquered border, fleets of different worlds turned their sensors toward it, trying to understand what they were seeing. The ships that called themselves human moved with calm precision, not like raiders or mercenaries, but like protectors guarding invisible boundaries. The patrol officers aboard the Concord stations stared in silence. None of them dared fire, for even without weapons drawn, those vessels radiated an authority that silenced arrogance. Captain Rhea Salas watched the data stream flow across her console. She knew the eyes of a civilization were upon her. Every maneuver she made, every word she spoke would write the first line of a history no one had dared imagine. She stood tall, her face lit by the pale reflection of stars, and she ordered the fleet to hold formation and transmit medical frequencies to any nearby civilian channels. She wanted them to see that humanity had not come to take but to give. Cale Veer stood on the observation deck of the Concord cruiser Luminant. Watching it all unfold before his eyes, he had read about light in old poems, but no words had ever captured what he was seeing. The human ships were alive, with motion, their hulls marked by strange patterns like scars of travel through storms of radiation and war. Yet they shone clean like new iron reborn in fire. Cale's communicator buzzed with messages from the council demanding he record and report everything for historical record, but he barely heard them. He could feel something ancient rising in his chest, a recognition that came not from intellect, but from the marrow of his being. The first distress signal came from a nearby trade convoy caught between pirate raiders and a drifting field of asteroids. The Concord response was delayed as the council argued over whether to risk revealing their positions. Rhea did not wait. She gave her command to burn engines to full and move. The dauntless forward, the human fleet moved as one, a silent storm of light breaking through the dark. She opened every broadcast channel available and spoke clearly across the void to all frequencies. "This is Captain Rhea Salas of the Union of Human Systems. We respond to any vessel in danger. Stand by for aid." The conquered officers watching from their control decks felt their throats tighten hearing that voice. It was calm, disciplined, merciful, the opposite of the myth they had been told. The pirates saw the incoming fleet and hesitated. Their scanners could not identify the signatures, and panic spread among their ranks. The first wave scattered into the asteroid belt trying to flee, but the human ships were faster, more coordinated. The Dauntless extended tractor fields and pulled damaged freighters to safety, while medbays inside the smaller escort ships lit up with life drones poured out carrying supplies, oxygen pods, and field doctors in suits marked with the old Earth sigil. No one in the Concord had seen that emblem in living color for 1,000 years. It looked like history itself had stepped from its own grave and taken command of the battlefield. Cale stood, trembling as the images appeared on every broadcast link across the network. He saw human officers moving through the wreckage helping alien survivors. Their faces uncovered, their gestures steady and kind. He recorded the footage with shaking hands, his voice barely holding as he narrated what he saw, living proof of humanity, the myth that had shaped empires, the dream that had built laws now breathing again. He transmitted the raw footage to the Concord archives, bypassing security encryption. He wanted the truth to go out before politics could bury it again. Inside the High Council chamber, the reaction was chaos. Half the assembly shouted to open dialogue, the other half demanded immediate containment. Councillor Dareth struck his staff against the floor to silence them, and declared that this revelation would not leave the chamber. But even as he spoke, the broadcast spread faster than he could stop it. Every citizen with a signal receiver now watched in awe as humans rescued strangers. From certain death mothers wept in the capital streets. Fathers lifted their children to see the screens as if showing them a miracle. Rhea stood in the medbay as alien survivors were carried in their scales burned and eyes wide with disbelief. On why of them, a small trader reached for her hand and whispered in broken Concord speech that he thought she was a story. Rhea smiled softly and said, "Maybe I am, but stories can still help people." The alien closed his eyes as the doctors worked, and Rhea looked around at her crew moving in harmony. She knew that whatever war had taken humanity from the stars before, it would not take them again. Cale sent his report with one final message attached. The truth cannot be erased forever. It only waits for courage to find it. Then he looked out the window and saw the human ships returning to formation around the Thorn Gate, their lights pulsing in unison like a single living organism. The sight filled him with a strange kind of peace. He felt that everything lost could be found again if someone just believed enough to search. The Concord citizens now spoke the name human aloud without fear or laughter. The myth had become flesh, and the galaxy was no longer the same. The Council could no longer deny what billions had seen, proof of flesh and fire, of compassion and strength, united in a people who had returned not to rule, but to remind the stars of what they had forgotten, what it meant to be alive. The trial of Truth. Cale Vire stood in the Grand Assembly Hall of the Aurelian Concord, where rows of councillors shimmered beneath banners of order and peace, their faces lit by the pale light of truth now impossible to hide. He had returned from the Thorn Gate with evidence so overwhelming that even the oldest lies trembled under its weight. The recordings of the human fleet rescuing civilians had flooded every network, every home, every mind across the Concord. Yet instead of celebration, Cale found himself accused of treason for releasing classified material. The council chamber buzzed with the voices of power men and women who had spent lifetimes ruling over silence, now drowning in their own noise. Cale stood alone on the circular platform, his wrists bound by light bands, while 1,000 eyes watched from the gallery above. The Chancellor's voice echoed across the dome, asking Cale if he understood the crime of destabilizing unity. Cale replied in calm tone that unity built on deception was not unity at all. It was a cage made of fear. He told them that the myth of humanity had been used to keep the Concord obedient to those who claimed to protect it. But protection built on lies could not last. The chamber fell quiet for a moment, and Cale saw in some faces a flicker of doubt. But power does not yield to truth without a fight. So the Chancellor declared that Cale's words would be erased from record, and his sentence would be exile beyond the gate. Cale smiled not from arrogance, but because he knew the truth no longer needed his voice. The stars had already spoken. Far beyond the capital, Captain Rhea Salas and her fleet waited at the edge of the Thorn Gate. Her ship still positioned to defend the civilian lanes. Her comm officers brought reports that the Concord had cut all communication links. No replies, no acknowledgments, only silence. The silence that comes before betrayal. Her second in command, Commander Elias, approached with tense eyes, saying that a Concord strike group had begun to mobilize near their flank. It looked like a maneuver disguised as patrol. Rhea exhaled slowly. She had expected this. The truth had shaken a structure that feared collapse, and fear always finds comfort in violence. She gave a calm order to keep the shields powered but weapons cold. They would not fire first, no matter what came. Inside the Concord halls, Counselor Dareth met secretly with a group of officers who called themselves the Preservation Circle. Their plan was simple. They would stage an attack near the Thorn Gate, frame it as human aggression, and rally the frightened colonies under Concord control again. Dareth hesitated for a moment, knowing the cost of war, but ambition is a voice that speaks louder than conscience, and he signed the order with trembling hands. The false attack began hours later. Automated drones painted with human signals swooping down on a Concord freighter near the outer lane. Explosions bloomed across the void, and the broadcast was transmitted live across 100 systems, showing what appeared to be human betrayal. Cale watched from his cell as the feed played on a projection above the guard desk. He shouted that it was false, that it was manipulation, but his voice echoed unheard. The guards ignored him until one finally whispered that he had seen the real footage before the blackout, and knew Cale spoke truth. The guard's courage grew in that instant, and he released the bonds, saying go. Before they erased more than data, Cale escaped through the lower corridors of the capital while the alarms blared. He sent a transmission through the last unblocked network channel directly to Rhea Salas, warning her of the deception and begging her to hold her fire aboard. Dauntless, the crew watched, in shock as Concord media accused them of the very crime they had worked to prevent. Commander Elias cursed under his breath and demanded they respond with force. But Rhea raised her hand. She said quietly that truth needs witnesses, not martyrs. She ordered a full data burst of their sensor logs to every open channel, proving that the attack was staged and that the ships involved were Concord drones stolen from restricted depots. The data traveled faster than censorship could follow, reaching colonies, miners, traders, and common people who had already begun to question the council's stories within hours. Protests erupted in the capital, citizens demanding the release of Cale and an end to the lies. Cale found shelter in an abandoned transmission hub on the city's edge and used its old relays to amplify Rhea's signal. He spoke into the comm one last time, his voice raw but steady, telling every world that humanity had not returned to conquer, but to remind them that truth cannot be outlawed. His broadcast spread like wildfire until even the council chambers could not shut it down. The illusion shattered. The people had seen enough, and once the mind of a civilization opens, it cannot return to sleep in that moment. Rhea looked out from the bridge of Dauntless as Concord ships hesitated, their captains uncertain, their orders tangled by the flood of real information. She whispered that perhaps the stars were finally listening. She did not want blood. She wanted understanding, and Cale's courage had given that chance. The council's trap had failed. The truth had survived the trial, not through victory, but through the refusal to yield to fear. The Thorn Gate glowed softly behind her like a halo around a wound that was beginning to heal. And as her ships drifted in silent vigil, she knew this was only the beginning, for the galaxy had witnessed the trial of truth, and now the balance between myth and power could never return to what it once was. The battle for the gate, the Thorn Gate, hung in the black like a burning crown, its rings turning slow and bright with energy storms spiraling between them, each spark a heartbeat of tension. The Concord had split itself in two, half its fleet standing by the old council, half holding their positions, uncertain whether to fight or to listen. The human fleet waited in perfect silence, weapons powered down, engines glowing soft blue as if the ships themselves were breathing. Captain Rhea Salas stood on the bridge of Dauntless, her eyes fixed on the gate. She knew that peace balanced on a thread thinner than air. One wrong move and the first war between humanity and the Concord would ignite across the stars. Her crew moved around her with quiet purpose, every officer alert, every motion deliberate. They trusted her calm more than armor. She had become the center of their courage. Kyle Veer moved through the underbelly of the conquered capital as chaos unfolded above him. The people had risen in protest against the false, attack chanting for truth and demanding the end of the council's control. The air smelled of smoke and electricity, banners of unity torn down and replaced with words of freedom. He pushed through the crowd toward the main data relay tower, the only line that could broadcast across the entire conquered grid. He carried the last archive key that his mentor Saren had hidden away years ago. It could override all state filters. If he reached the control room, the truth would be shown everywhere. Once and for all, his mind raced with the thought that perhaps Rhea and her fleet still held their fire, waiting for proof he could not fail her. Above the Thorngate Counselor, Dareth stood aboard his command carrier, watching the protests from orbit. He was pale and trembling. He had not expected the lie to break so fast. The Preservation Circle blamed him for the collapse, and now demanded he take decisive action to prove his loyalty. Their ships had already begun to charge weapons targeting the human fleet to stage another false flag attack, this time live with no witnesses left to argue. Dareth knew it would destroy the gate and countless lives, yet fear wrapped around him like cold steel. He gave the order fire on the flagship. Make sure the humans are blamed. History will forgive what it cannot remember. On Dauntless, the alarms screamed the instant the Concord weapons charged. Commander Elias called out that multiple energy signatures were building fast. Rhea's heart clenched. She had seen too many wars start from fear. She ordered evasive maneuver shields to full, but still no return fire. She would not let humanity be remembered as the spark of destruction. The first volley of plasma cut across the void, tearing through the debris fields near the gate. Explosions blossomed like red suns lighting the empty dark. Her ships moved with perfect grace, scattering, without breaking formation, each one covering the other like dancers in a pattern learned through centuries of survival. Kale reached the relay tower entrance. Breathless and bruised security drones blocked the doors, but the crowds followed him now. Citizens who had seen his earlier broadcast, they surrounded the gates shouting, "Let him through, let him speak." The drones hesitated, caught between conflicting orders. Kale used the moment to slip inside. Running up the narrow stairways with the key clutched in his hand, he reached the control deck and saw the transmission hub glowing, ready to receive. He plugged in the archive key and the system came alive, screens flickering across every channel showing the real evidence. The Preservation Circle's orders, the falsified transmissions, the footage of the drones painted to look like human ships. He pressed the send command and whispered for Rhea to hold one more moment, in orbit. The data burst, reached every ship at once. The human fleet received it first, followed by the conquered captains, then the open broadcast carried it to all channels. The truth filled the void faster than light itself. Officers on conquered ships stared at their screens, seeing their own leaders exposed as traitors. Confusion spread through the ranks and the firing stopped. Dareth's carrier hung silent, its weapon system still glowing with charge. The crew no longer obeying his commands. The circle had vanished, leaving him alone in shame. Rhea watched the energy. Signatures fade, she did not cheer. She only whispered that truth had fought harder than any cannon. She opened communications to all frequencies and said, "We did not come here to destroy. We came here to return and to protect those who cannot protect themselves." Her words echoed through every ship, every station. Her voice calm and steady, like the sound of an old home remembered in the dark. Kale looked out the window of the relay tower as the city lights flickered back to life. He could hear people cheering in the streets, the sound rolling like a tide across the capital. He smiled for the first time without fear, his body shaking from exhaustion. He thought of Saren, and of Rhea, and of the word carved into the old hull fragment. Home, he finally understood. It was not a place, it was a promise. Above the gate, the fleet stood still, their weapons dimmed their formations, softening like the slow breath of peace. Rhea gave the order to power down the engines and let the silence settle. She knew the battle was over. Not through victory or surrender, but through understanding. The Thorngate now stood not as a barrier, but as a bridge between what was myth and what was true. Humanity had not won a war. It had healed a wound carved across centuries. The gate turned once more, catching the light of a nearby star and scattering it across the ships like rain. The storm had ended, and from its quiet ashes, something new began to rise, a galaxy ready to remember. Names. In the constellations, the battle had ended without a final shot, and yet the echo of it lived across the stars for many days. The space around the Thorn Gate was filled with drifting fragments of broken drones, silent witnesses of the lie that had almost burned a galaxy, the Concord. Fleets and the human ships remained at a careful distance from each other. Engines' low shields cold the vast rings of the gate, spinning slow and bright like a heartbeat of peace. Captain Rhea Salas stood on the bridge of Dauntless, her uniform torn at the sleeve, her eyes hollow yet calm. She had not slept since the first shot was fired. She had waited for confirmation that the transmissions had spread, that the truth had won. Kale Vire's message had done what weapons could not. It had freed thought itself, and now she stared at the bright line of the gate and whispered that history had come full circle. Down on the conquered capital, the crowds had turned their fury into hope. Kale stood among them, unchained, his name now carried through every broadcast across every colony. As the scholar who had broken silence, the council that once accused him of treason now called him before them again, not as prisoner, but as witness. The chamber that had once been cold with fear was now crowded with representatives from every world, their faces weary yet open. The chancellor spoke with a quieter voice this time, asking what humanity desired from the Concord. Kyle thought carefully. Before he answered, he said, "Humanity did not come to rule, it came to return. It came to share the burden of keeping life alive in a universe that forgets too easily the value of compassion." He told them that truth had cost enough blood. It was time to build, not burn. Captain Rhea and her crew were invited to the surface for talks, the first human boots to touch Concord soil in centuries. When she stepped from the landing craft, the air felt heavy with memory. Crowds gathered behind barriers to see the living proof of what they had once called myth. People reached out to touch the ship, to whisper words of welcome mixed with disbelief. Rhea moved through them with humility, her eyes catching Kale's in the distance. They had never met before, but the moment they did, it felt like recognition, not of faces but of purpose. The same fire burned in both, the fire to protect what is right even when the world denies it, in the great hall where the new treaty would be written. Rhea stood beside Kale, the air alive with quiet awe between the two. Flags, one old one newly raised, the symbol of the Union and the Concord side by side. She spoke for humanity, saying that the gate would remain open not as a border, but as a corridor for all who sought aid, trade, or refuge. She said that every ship, no matter its origin, would be protected if it came in peace. Her words were plain yet carried the weight of every lost generation. Kale stood next to her, adding that the archives of both civilizations would merge into one shared memory so that no truth could ever again be erased, and that the myth of humanity would become a living lesson. Not a warning, but a reminder that belief can rebuild worlds. When the treaty was signed, the first star of the new dawn rose over the capital. The citizens cheered, and the sound rolled across the cities like wind across oceans. Rhea looked upward through the skylight where the stars were beginning to appear one by one. She thought of those who had died in silence, those who had carried hope through centuries of exile, and she said quietly that they would not be forgotten. Kale heard her words and smiled. He told her that in the new records, each system would be given the name of those who had fallen in the fight for truth, that every star could hold a name, every constellation a memory, so that when children looked up at night, they would see the story of how light returned, far above the capital. The Dauntless drifted in orbit, its hull scarred but shining like a relic of faith. The crew gathered on the observation deck, watching as new stations activated around the Thorn Gate, now marked as a neutral zone shared by both species. Engineers from both sides worked side by side, laughter replacing suspicion, the stars reflected in their eyes, as if the universe itself had drawn them closer together. Rhea stood with her officers, looking at the bridge that stretched between myth and reality. She felt the weight of command lift from her shoulders, replaced by something gentler, pride not in conquest but in endurance. She whispered that perhaps this was what it meant to be Starborn. Not chosen by blood but by courage, Kyle returned to the archives that had once been his prison. Now open to all, he walked the same halls where he had once moved in fear, the same shelves where lies had hidden and now glowed with living data of both worlds. He placed the hull fragment that had started it all at the center display under the light of the first restored beacon, the word carved upon, at home still clear and strong. He smiled, knowing that the word no longer belonged to one planet or one people. It belonged to everyone who had ever looked into the dark and chosen to believe. Ria's final transmission went out across the galaxy, her voice soft and steady, telling every listener that humanity had not returned to claim its place but to share it, that the stars belonged to all who dared to reach for them. She ended with words that would echo for generations. We are not the myth, we are the memory and the promise. The night above the Thorn Gate glittered brighter than ever before, each star pulsing like a heartbeat, each one carrying a new name carved into the constellations of peace, and every ship that passed through. That light carried with it the same message that truth endures, that unity can be born from ruin, and that even in the endless dark, the story of humanity will always find a way to shine again. The stars above the Thorn Gate glowed like living fire, each one pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to echo through the hulls of every ship, humanity and the Concord together, drifting in still peace. Kyle Veer stood on the terrace of the Capitol Tower, his eyes reflecting the galaxies stretched across the sky. He could hear laughter rising from the streets below. People from both worlds walking side by side. No banners, no guards, no fear. Just the hum of a civilization beginning again. The archives. Behind him were open to the public, the forbidden sealed chambers now filled with children exploring the stories once buried. He smiled, thinking how truth had fought harder than any weapon, how faith in something unseen had rebuilt what reason alone could not. He whispered that myths are not lies, they are memories waiting to return. Captain Ria Salas stood aboard the Dauntless one last time, her uniform crisp, her voice calm. She gazed through the viewport where the Thorn Gate shimmered like a bridge of gold. The new treaty ships moved in and out freely, carrying food, medicine, and knowledge. The corridor was alive with travel, the first shared artery between two species that had once lived in shadows. She placed her hand on the console, feeling the heartbeat of the ship she had commanded through silence and storm. She thought of those who never made it this far. The nameless wanderers, the lost crews, the ones who believed when believing meant exile. She whispered a promise that their names would not fade, they would be written among the stars so that no one would forget the cost of rediscovery. Kyle joined her later, standing quietly beside the viewport. He carried a small data crystal that contained the complete unified record of the human return, the Concord reconciliation, and the fall of the preservation circle. He said softly that it would be uploaded into every archive, every education system, every home, because truth must be shared, not stored. Ria nodded, saying that someday a child would read it and think it was just a story. And maybe that was all right, because stories keep the heart alive. Kyle laughed gently, agreeing that perhaps one day they would be myth again. But this time an honest one born from unity, not fear. Beyond the glass, the stars shifted as the gate realigned for the next transit cycle. Light flowed along its outer rings, tracing the names newly engraved. Their names of the fallen, names of the brave, names of those who had dared to believe, each one forming part of a constellation shaped like a human hand reaching outward, the official seal of the new alliance of worlds. Ria looked at it in silence, her heart heavy with pride. She felt that this was what it meant to be Starborn, not a legend of conquest but a truth of endurance, the will to rise after being forgotten, to choose compassion over domination, and to walk into the unknown. Carrying light as the gate flared for departure, the Dauntless prepared to sail once more, this time not to fight but to explore. Ria gave the command to engage engines, and the ship moved forward into the great horizon. The people below cheered, watching the silver silhouette disappear into the mist of starlight. Kale remained on the observation deck long after it vanished, whispering that every beginning hides in an ending and every ending lights another beginning. He knew the universe would remember this day, not because of power or war, but because two species had chosen understanding over fear, and that choice would echo forever through the constellations. And when night returned to quiet, the last transmission from Dauntless reached every world, Captain Ria's voice calm and certain, saying, "Humanity has come home not to rule, but to remind that even in darkness there is always light waiting to be believed." And the message repeated across every relay, across every system, until it became a lullaby for the new age. The stars burned brighter than ever before, each one carrying a name, each one a promise that no truth would ever again be silenced. And as the light spread across the infinite sky, the universe itself seemed to breathe a little softer, as if it too had found peace. The end.